It's the Wonkhe Show. We're talking about free speech and the fallout from a record fine to a university this week, and why franchise HE is back in the news. It's all coming up.
But I am absolutely furious at the loopholes that have existed. Why have they existed? Honestly, because policymakers, and I include myself in this, are often not as creative thinking and as, let's call it, entrepreneurial with the law and the loophole as those who seek to bend the edges of the law.
Welcome back to the Wonkhe Show, your weekly way into this week's higher education news, policy and analysis. I'm your host, Mark Leach, and joining me for a journey through the Kafka-esque HE policy conversation this week, we have three fantastic guests as always. In London, it's Vivienne Stern, Chief Executive at UK. Vivienne, your heart of the week, please.
Well, it's been a quiet week, verging on boring, but my highlight was watching my son play Gaston in Beauty and the Beast last night. And I know that, parents are a bit like this, but he was so bloody brilliant. I was so proud of him.
Lovely. Somewhere in Scotland, it's Jonathan Simons, Partner and Head of Education for Public First. Jonathan, your heart of the week, please.
Morning, Mark. Morning, everyone. Our highlight of the week, as people may have seen, Public First has been acquired by our now parent company called Stonehaven, who are based up in Scotland, which is why I'm up here today. So it's been a very, very busy but exciting week.
And in North London, it's McVitty, Wonkhe's editor. Debbie, your heart of the week, please.
Well, good morning, everyone. Yesterday, I had the pleasure of going to the beautiful campus of UE Bristol, and it was a lovely sunny day, and I was there for a creative collaborations event with our partners Adobe, and it was really brilliant to see that even though people are kind of struggling in the kind of difficult circumstances that the sector finds itself in, there's still loads of innovation and creative thinking going on, and I got to hear about some of that, so that was very cheering indeed.
Right, so we start the week with the HE policy meteor, that is the RFS fine on the University of Sussex. Debbie, walk us through the facts, please.
Right, so this is the publication of the investigation from the Office for Students into the University of Sussex. The conclusion of which was that the university has been issued with quite a substantial fine on the basis of breaches of conditions of registration. So this investigation took place following the departure of academic Kathleen Stock from the university. It was not an investigation into the circumstances surrounding that departure, which are well documented, but it was about whether the university had breached conditions of registration. And after a lot of in-depth investigation, OFS concluded that it had. So a lot of this centred around the university's policy statement on trans and non-binary equality, which OFS considered to have created a sort of chilling effect on free speech and may have caused staff and students to self-censor. I think it's really important to say that the university is pushing back quite strongly on this conclusion. The Vice Chancellor, Sasha Roseneil, said that the process was Kafka-esque and that the findings were egregious and concocted. And there's been lots of subsequent debate about what the implications might be for university policies on, around harassment, around bullying, around their ability to protect groups that would be subject to harmful propaganda. And of course, the free speech legislation was happening in the background as this happened. So Arif Ahmed has been fronting the findings, the conclusions of the investigation, despite the fact that all this investigation was launched well before he was in post or his post had even been created in law. So there's a lot of complexity here to get into.
I want to start with you, Vivienne. Sasha, the Vice-Chancellor, claims that the ruling basically makes it impossible to prevent bullying that isn't actually illegal. Is she right? And how do universities create respectful environments now on the back of all this?
We have to relentlessly emphasise that the sector believes that freedom of speech and its cousin academic freedom it is the responsibility of universities to protect those things. They're bound by law to do so, but it's also core to the operation of university. I think there are three issues with this judgment, which bears very, very close reading. There are process issues. There are issues around the proportionality of the fine. And there are issues of principle, which I think raise all sorts of questions about what this judgment might mean for all other universities in the English sector. We are going to write to the OFS setting out a set of questions that we think this judgment raises. But you mention the one that I think for me sits right at the heart of this. And without going into enormous detail, those of you who are, familiar with the judgment will perhaps know that there is a section on page 11 of the report which talks about a thing that they call the safeguard statement, which was a statement which was intended to make it clear that nothing in the trans and non-binary policy statement should be taken to justify disproportionate restrictions on free speech. So it was an attempt by the university to sort of make sure in a revised version of that statement that freedom of speech should be protected. It goes on to say that this was ineffective and undermined, and I'm quoting, because of ... amongst other things, the inclusion of the restriction on abusive, bullying or harassing material. So for me, the question this raises is, does the OFS believe that it is inappropriate for higher education providers to place restrictions on speech or material which is abusive, bullying or harassing? If so, is that in all circumstances or just in some? I think, that raises a further question, which we're all familiar with, that speech may be, the same speech may be legal in one set of circumstances and illegal in another, and that the circumstances are often dynamic. And we've all rehearsed this endlessly, particularly in relation to the last 18 months, as we've seen the enormous challenge universities have faced in balancing the rights of students to protest and express their views about what's happening in Gaza, with the rights of particularly Jewish students to be protected from harassment and abuse and from anti-Semitism. And so for me, the thing that I think is extraordinary about it is it takes a situation, a set of kind of legal parameters which were already very difficult for universities to navigate. And instead of, after 3.5 years, mind you, and probably hundreds of thousands of pounds of cost on both sides, I think it increases the uncertainty over how universities are, really supposed to navigate this, rather than clarifying it. And for me, that is intensely problematic.
Right, so lot to unpack there. Jonathan, I want to give you a chance on this before we get into some of Vivienne's wider points. So the VC of Sussex called the judgment libertarian free speech absolutism, which I thought was an interesting formulation. Is a middle ground in what's become such a polarized debate? Is this a middle ground, or is this just more?
I mean, you can't deny that the vice chancellor and her comms team have got an eye for a soundbite. I thought it was an excellent use of the thesaurus here. Look, Sussex are obviously extremely vexed, and I understand why. And in a sense, credit to them for not sort of setting down on not being pusillanimous and not, saying, oh yes, all right, woe is us, we got it completely wrong. Our fault. So absolutely, credit for them for illustrating. And as Viv has said, there's a lot of complicated issues raised here. The only thing that I slightly take issue on is, issues like this are always a balance of laws, and they are always a balance of laws which point in contradictory directions. And this doesn't just apply in issues of free speech versus harassment. This applies in many aspects of law where, people who are regulated, and ultimately, if it comes to it, the courts, have to constantly decide on this balance between, on the one hand, this, and on the other hand, this. And, this is why, a part of the reason why this took so long is because it's the first time this was really being explored. And so the OFS is treading new legal ground, partly because, as you said, the free speech sort of additional regulations and duties came in sort of halfway through, then sort of came out again, and now have sort of partly come back in again. And they themselves had I suppose probably the opposite of a chilling effect, a magnifying effect, even though they weren't strictly speaking in law for some of this time. But also because this is trying to navigate through two, on the face of it, mutually contradictory approaches. But as I say, that's not uncommon here. And so where I do disagree with Sussex is I absolutely don't think it's free speech absolutism. If it was free speech absolutism, this would not take 3.5 years to resolve. It would be very, very simple. Does the academic in question have a right? Yes, they do. Boom, job done. Judgment made that, the university was at fault. It's taken so long precisely because they are trying to look at what is in the wording of the law, precise and proportionate. So it's not just, do you have a policy on this? It's, do you have a policy? Exactly what does that policy allow you to do? And does it do so in a really specific way? Does the policy policy go beyond the law? If it does go beyond the law, is there a justification for doing so? These are complicated issues and these are nuanced issues, but I fear we're kidding ourselves if we ever think they are not going to be. And every single time we've had a case like this, we talked about Joe Phoenix and Open University last time I was on the podcast. These are complicated issues, right? Where you are trying to judge up academic freedom, protection against minority students, the right of academics to speak freely. These are always going to be complicated issues. And even in areas which are fairly well trodden, like broader employment law, two different judges and two different cases and two different courts can make entirely different judgments on things that are ostensibly the same. And so I'm absolutely not passing judgment on this particular case. But as I say, I think we are kidding ourselves if we think this is ever going to result in a really nice and neat, as long as you do the following 5 things, universities, you'll always be fine. If you ever do the following 3 things, that's always wrong. I don't think we'll ever get there.
This is why the judgment bears such close reading, because the substance of the case is not about a university which tried to prevent an academic saying something or instructed an academic to not teach certain material or to... The substance of it is whether or not the existence of this policy created a chilling effect. Kathleen Stock has reported that she did self-censor. She felt that the existence of the policy did cause her to self-censor, and the OFS has found that it is possible, hypothetically, that others would have self-censored because of the existence of the policy. But I think it's important, without getting drawn into the substance of the case, to just remind people that the University of Sussex did not fire Kathleen Stock. They employed her, promoted her, and submitted some of her research as a ref impact case study. I think the other thing it's important to point out is that, there's an article in the Times today on Kathleen Stock's experience, and that, she was subject to intolerable bullying, harassment, and abuse. There were campus posters stuck up, there were placards waved, stock out, that kind of thing. And that's referenced in the report. But the central confusion, I think, in the judgment is that seems to me precisely the kind of material that a university might feel unable to prevent being sort of curtailed. You might feel that you can't take down a poster that expresses a legal but nonetheless harassing view because of this apparent sort of statement that freedom of speech is always curtailed if you have such a kind of approach to preventing abuse, harassment and bullying. And that seems to me just enormously confused.
Just talk about the investigation itself, because there's also been a lot of consternation about that. I mean, Debbie, 3.5 years does seem like quite a long time for an investigation. Sussex says it wasn't even contacted, students and staff not actually interviewed, and then obviously there's this wider conversation about the fine that everyone has mentioned, which is obviously the highest that OFS has ever handed out. Do you think that the time lag here is a problem? I think that getting it right is probably important, but I think one of the consequences of taking a long time over these things should be that the process itself is very transparent. I think that OFS is very clear how they arrived at that number for the fine. Albeit it's a sort of there's an element of number wang involved, I guess. But I suppose that put it like this. I suppose that the first time this happens, as Jonathan says, you're flying blind. The legislative framework is changing behind you. It's all there's an awful lot of kind of hot air and noise around it. And I genuinely I can't speak to who spoke to whom and whether the kind of due process was carried out. I think clearly there will be some things were probably done, some things were probably not done, and there'll be lessons to learn, and that that will be kind of rehearsed ongoing. I think that the aspiration of the free speech legislation is that where there is something arises, it is resolved fairly briskly by the institution and then subsequently fairly briskly by OFS, so that it becomes possible for these things not to become a kind of circus. Whether that is a feasible proposition given the complexities of these different cases, I think it was definitely one of the points of discussion at the point at which the legislation was going through. And I don't know whether there's a version of the future in which it becomes a bit more routine to say, okay, this is how we investigate these things. This is the kind of balance. These are the sort of judgments we're able to weigh up. To sort of accept that sometimes there may be, that there's a kind of a basket of processes that OFS will recognise as being kind of appropriate and to kind of achieve a sort of collective learning on this. Albeit, I do kind of question whether this is a good use of anyone's time.
or whether it just continues to be kind of murky and drawn out and media catnip and the whole thing just becomes more and more kind of toxic and miserable. I hope the first, I fear the second.
But yeah, that brings me on. I want to ask Vivienne about how the rest of the sector is reacting to this. So there's obviously the fine, which is very large. We discussed 15 times bigger than previous OFS fines. What is your sense of how other vice chancellors and other universities are looking at this, responding, and thinking about what they might have to do in response?
Well, if I was a vice chancellor, I would be reading this very carefully and be trying to work out what in this judgment might apply to me. I think the comments Arafah made yesterday made it quite clear that he thinks it's possible that further fines could be issued and that it might be even larger in scale. And it's important when you read the judgment to note that, and I think Debbie's right about number wang. I thought that myself, that there was sort of this fairly arbitrary initial figure which was much larger, which was then heavily discounted. Yeah. And there's sort of the heavy discounting, I think, was partly a result of kind of pushback in the course of the investigation on a number of sort of fronts, including. But I mean, for me, right, the OFS has taken 3.5 years to produce a judgment in this case. One of the reasons that they say such a significant fine is justified is because the breach has been going on for a long time. They are, really resting their case on a policy document that was issued in 2018, which was then revised following complaints in 2022, and again in 2023, and again in 2024, all without the benefit of any insight from the OFS on what they would regard a compliant version of that statement to look like. So I think the fact that the OFS has taken such a very long time about it, and the fact that, as far as I understand it, they did not, although this is one of the questions I want to ask the OFS, they didn't provide any assistance to the OFS in getting that statement into a compliant version. And in fact, in the final judgment, they're still saying we reserve our position on whether the 2024 version of the statement is compliant. So if they're partly using this case as a way of saying to the rest of the sector, get your house in order, I mean, my question, having read it very, very closely, would be how? What is it that I should take from this? If I had a similar statement, if I based it on the 2024 version of the Sussex statement, would I be compliant? I don't think we know that. And so, it kind of comes back to the point, about if the OFS's motivation is protecting the student interest, there were ways that they could have got faster to what they would regard as a sort of position where the student interest was protected than going about it in this way. And I think that's, in a sense, one of the process points we'd like to raise. I mean, there's a million other things about it that I think are kind of problematic, but including whether this is the best use of everybody's resources.
So I completely agree that one of the things that this has thrown up is the role of the Office for Students. So if the Office for Students is acting, as in this case, in essentially a quasi-judicial capacity, they can't, under that role, help one of the parties in a case try to resolve things. You can't employ a judge to try and help you. But if, as Viv correctly says, they are also trying to regulate in the student interest, then they absolutely can and should be working with universities to try and help them navigate this, rather than saying, no, we think what the answer is, but you just have to keep on guessing. You just have to keep on revising your policy, and at some point we may or may not tell you got it right. So whether they're acting as a quasi-judicial role, whether they're acting in the student interest, whether they are a regulator, whether they are a sort of an organisation that is meant to be helping students and universities navigate through this, depending on which of those roles they think they are holding at any one time, makes a massive difference to how they act here. And I fully accept that is complicated for the sector.
It's also complicated for the government, isn't it? I just want to ask you one more thing about this, Jonathan. Sorry, Debbie, please come back in a second. But, it won't escape anyone's notice that, we've had a significant change of government since this investigation was launched. And there's been a House of Lords and a government review that both in different ways criticised OFS for being kind of basically too combative. And that, so there's quite a lot of water under the bridge since this has all started. Obviously, the government has to support the findings in this case, but do you think they'll be looking at this and thinking, if this is going to be the consequence of, that free speech legislation and everything else, maybe, is the balance quite right here? Do you think it prompts a bit more of a stock take? I mean, a lot of this is being reviewed and thought about anyway, but I wonder if, it does show a slightly different, obviously it's being received by, a very different government and with very different priorities and who may be looking at this different to how, Conservative ministers would have done, when it was originally launched.
I am very certain that a Labour government wouldn't have probably introduced all of this additional legislation around free speech in the first place and wouldn't have appointed a free speech czar. And of course, one of the things which they did do was pause the implementation of the Act before, reintroducing an element of it later on. But again, they could have formally scrapped Arif Ahmed's post, and they didn't. They have essentially, reappointed him, at least implicitly. They could have held the line on saying we're not going to implement the last bit of the free speech duty, and they didn't. They've held the line. So I don't actually think that this case will cause them to sort of think, what have we created here? I suspect the actual concern is, well, on the one hand, we're telling the OFS not to be too combative. On the other hand, we are also saying to them, well, look, you can't bring in new providers because you've got to spend all your time talking about financial sustainability, and we've appointed a new chair. And in the item we're just about to talk about, we've now simultaneously given the OFS more powers around protecting public money and franchising. You get no bonus points on the Wonkhe podcast for defending the OFS here, but they are at least partly causing a cleft stick. Does the government want them to do less, or does it want them to do more? And depending on which topic you're on, the government simultaneously wants them to do both.
So just to point, I think we actually need a government that positions itself as firmly on the freedom of speech side of the ledger. We need an effective and robust regulator, because if we don't have that, I think the sector as a whole is very vulnerable to those people who just don't believe the sector can be trusted. So I think I can understand precisely why Bridget Phillipson did what she did, but it has to be an effective, robust and functional regulator, and I think that's the problem.
Right, let's see who's been blogging for us this week.
Hi, I'm Claire Toogood from AGCAS, and this week on Wonkhe, I've been blogging about the latest HISA consultation and how it affects professional services staff. AGCAS have joined together with several other membership organisations to release a statement supporting HISA's proposal to widen the coverage of the higher education staff record. At the moment, staff who aren't on academic contracts in institutions in England and Northern Ireland don't have to be included in the staff data returned to HISA. Last year, just under half of providers opted out of submitting this data. However, all higher education staff contribute to the success of their students, graduates and universities. They all deserve recognition and visibility. The proposed changes from HISA are an important step towards that. The consultation also suggests an end to the term non-academic for those in technical, professional and operational roles, which would be a much-needed change to an unhelpful and divisive label. At AGCAS, we represent everyone working in careers and employability in higher education, and we want all of our members to be fairly represented in the national data.
Now, franchise higher education is back in the news this week. Jonathan, tell us why.
This is one of the biggest financial scandals universities have faced. So says none a figure less than Bridget Phillipson, the Secretary of State, who was writing in the Sunday Times this weekend following a pretty major front page splash by the paper into franchising in the higher education sector. Now, long-time readers of Wonkhe will not be surprised by much, if not almost all, of the content that was in the paper, but there is a big difference, or two big differences. One is that this splashed the Sunday Times, the paper of record. Previous HE stories, including discussions about whether students are being let in, international students being let in by the back door, which the Sunday Times made big play of, was actually quite deep into the paper. This is the front page splash. And the second thing is it has generated an immediate and quite significant amount of government pushback. So there was the Bridget Phillipson op-ed on the Sunday, and there was an immediate promise of action. And indeed, we have already had a follow-up written ministerial statement this week talking about immediate action that is going to be taken. Greater powers are going to be given to the Office for Students, and a formal introduction that the Public Sector Fraud Authority is going to be formally looking at some of the things that were mentioned in the Sunday Times, as well as promising, quote, immediate action on the use of agents to recruit domestic students, that we don't know quite yet what this looks like. All in all, this is a big story, and it has the potential for what we are, I think, contractually obliged to call cut through, by which I mean people who are not regular readers of Wonkhe are also reading the story and thinking about it. I think there are a lot of things that get raised here. It is another issue where the sector risks being on the being caught on the cleft stick of public opinion, in common with the last topic we were just talking about. So, as Vivienne said at the beginning, quiet week in the sector this week.
Right, yeah, and Vivienne, I kind of want to start with you because, as Jonathan says, this has got cut through for it's been in the press before, but this is probably the most significant time. We've been doing our best to investigate it and write about it over the years, but have been heavily threatened by lots of the actors involved because no one's wanted to either own up to being in partnership with either borderline borderline fraudulent or corrupt organizations. And those organizations, those businesses, and those individuals that have seen these loopholes in the system and, making huge amounts of money out of it, have also been looking to protect those interests in, extremely aggressive ways. So kind of frustrating for us because, we have been trying to knock on the door of this for a long time, and we've also trying to be warn the sector as well that, this is going on, but a lot of it seems to fall on deaf ears. So more of a comment than a question. I know it's annoying. But I want to ask you, why is it taken so long for mainstream universities, I'm talking about members of Universities UK, why has it taken so long for them to realise that getting into bed with some of these providers who are trying to defraud the system on the worst end, or at the best end are not committing fraud, but are, probably doing things that are of extremely low quality, very risky, and bringing the sector into disrepute in various different ways? Why has it taken so long for those mainstream universities to notice that that's been going on? Have they had their heads buried in the sand? Why does it take the Sunday Times for this to cut through? This has been going for a decade or more and very substantially grown in the last few years. Why has it taken so long to get to this point?
Well, look, the first thing is this is not a new issue, right? The Sunday Times is doing, I think there will be more than just the story that appeared last weekend. I think we'll see more over the next few weeks. What they're doing really is picking up on something that we have been really quite closely engaged in for a good few years. There was a spike in concern about franchise provision and some very odd patterns in SLC data maybe a couple of years ago. And a lot of sort of work went into investigating what was really happening in relation to that. Now, I think, as you know, and you mentioned the kind of difficulty of talking about this because it's an area where you put your foot wrong and you end up being sued. So I'm not going to name any institutions, and that's really probably quite frustration for people, but that's what I'm going to do. I think that there are institutions which have been alerted to concerns by the DFE, the OFS and the SLC, which has resulted in a kind of lot of people going over relationships with a fine-tooth comb. We got a group of universities together to try and strengthen the governance of these partnerships. So we've got a franchise governance framework, which, to be honest, I think we probably will have to look at again. I'm not sure that it'll stand up. It's, it may be that we need to revisit it. I've spent a lot of time talking to institutions with large volumes of franchise provision. What I generally get told is that since 2022, when, concern about this was first really sort of raised, there has been a huge change in the way that universities manage franchise partnerships. And I've got, chapter and verse from a number of institutions on how they scrutinise sort of admissions and attendance and English language capability and all the sort of things that are being raised by the Sunday Times. The issue, I think, is that there are some investigations going on which we inevitably don't know that much about. And I think the gap between what government may be able to see and what, is being investigated and what those sort of lead franchise, I feel like there's a gap in understanding. And I think the other thing is that franchise provision covers quite a kind of wide range of territory. And there is, of course, I made a kind of stupid comment, I think probably in the comment we put into the Sunday Times about not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I don't mean to say turn a blind eye. There's enough here that's valuable that you shouldn't worry about the fraud. Absolutely not. If there's fraud in this system, we have to weed it out, and we have to be on the side of robust arrangements to make sure that this system is not vulnerable to that sort of abuse. At the same time, where franchise provision has enabled universities to help fill cold spots, or where they're allowing students who traditional kind of models of higher education are quite difficult. I'll give you two examples. I don't think you probably know this, Mark. There are two counties that always spring to mind when I think about geographical cold spots. One is Dorset, and the other is Devon and Somerset. And if you think about, Somerset as an example, I think the only university in Somerset is Bath, depending on where, I don't know, Bath, Avon, Somerset, who knows? And somebody's going to get cross with me for that. And therefore, there are places where having franchise provision can take higher education to a population that isn't able to move, hundreds of miles to the nearest university. There are also students who've got jobs who need to be able to study evenings, weekends. And there is an argument that's made to us that some of these these franchise arrangements are really quite flexible, and they kind of provide higher education in a way that a traditional university isn't really set up to do, with kind of a 9 to 5, Monday to Friday type model. So I think we just need to be a bit surgical about this. I think we have to be on the side of rooting out abuse. I think there's probably much more that we need to do on domestic agents. And I think we need to close the gap between what the DfE and SLC can see and what the lead franchise providers.
So that's all. So I think that the biggest areas of concern are actually more in urban areas and in the poorest communities, in those where students are being missold, essentially fake higher education degrees. And, I do take the point that the kind of governance of this has been looked at, but in that time, between 2022 and now, absolutely eye-watering sums of money have been made in profit by these companies. So if there was concern raised in 22, not much has happened about it. And Jonathan, what I want to ask you is this kind of policy question, because there is fraud in the system, there's bad actors in the system, but there's another thing going on here, which is the direct and massive transfer of public funds into private bank accounts of the owners of these businesses. And that has happened without any public debate or scrutiny, and it's going on today, and it's probably going to be going on for the next indefinite amount of time until something dramatic changes. I don't know whether things are going to change on the back of Bridget Phillipson's intervention this week, but it feels like something is going to have to change. The thing that we struggle with at Wonkhe is how has this been allowed to happen, that the system was never, which was never designed for this. It was never designed that for people to make huge amounts of profit, absolutely huge amounts of profit. It really is. I'm not exaggerating. Out of the student loan book, the taxpayers' money. How have we allowed that to happen? And isn't there a question that Bridget Phillipson didn't talk about it at all? Isn't there a question for this government about whether they're comfortable with that? Surely that's the root of, because that's the incentive and the loophole and the thing, and that's what's enabled this to proliferate. And clearly, conversations about governance of these arrangements are far too slow and haven't done, as Vivienne said, that kind of surgical look at it. Because the evidence is the money's still flowing very freely out of the coffers of SLC and into private businesses.
So look, let me be angry and then let me be rational. I was really, really angry when I saw this front page story, and everyone who cares about and works in or works on behalf of or works with the sector should be angry, because this is really, really appalling. And I mean, we've all seen it, right? I have been to examples of let's call it good franchising, right? And I've seen examples where it absolutely has, it's fitted in cold spots, or it's allowed for evening courses, or it's allowed public sector workers who need training as part of their work, or it allows FE colleges to do provision. That is brilliant. I love that. But I've also walked around London and I've seen provision which is, with the best will in the world, let's be cautious here, right on the edge of what is legitimate. And more franchising is in the latter. It's in London, it's in Birmingham, it's in Manchester. These are not places that are short of higher education institutions of all tariff entry, with flexible routes that do an immense amount of work on widening participation. So to argue that we must have franchising because otherwise older students or students from lower tariff or students who have non-conventional or students who haven't studied in England, doesn't hold water. It's just not the case. Let me then be rational about it, because again, I don't think we should simply abolish franchising, because Viv makes a very good case for where in some instances it is needed. And so the question is, can you be surgical from a policy and regulatory point of view that allows for an FE college to teach some degrees, or for an area that is genuinely a cold spot to do some nursing provision in the evening, whilst also closing down the ones that we all have in our heads at the moment, even if we can't articulate them, who are siphoning off massive profit margins and are, again, at least on the edge of legitimacy. Now, again, I'm not saying there's not a role for for-profits in higher education. I'm generally all in favour of profit. I'm not saying there's not a role for private providers. That's fine. If you deliver high-quality provision with good outcomes and you are ultimately regulated, and if you can make a margin of that as well, and you happen to be privately owned, and that margin goes to shareholders, in principle, I have no issue with that at all. But I am absolutely furious at the loopholes that have existed. Why have they existed? Honestly, because policymakers, and I include myself in this, are often not as creative thinking and as, let's call it, entrepreneurial with the law and the loophole as those who seek to bend the edges of the law. And this is a genuine problem in policymaking. making, which is that policymakers are often not capable of thinking about the ways in which laws that they design can be subverted. And that means that in some areas, there is always going to be an element of catch-up that is needed. Fine. But if there is an element of catch-up needed, let's really get on and do that catch-up, right? And let's think about a way in which we can be surgical. Let's think about a way in which we can protect the necessity of franchising in some instances with coming down like a ton of bricks on people who are, skirting the very edge of what is allowable.
Vivienne, I want to push you on this a little bit more because, on the theme of coming down on a ton of bricks, if you knew that your members were, working in the full knowledge in partnership with fraudulent providers, would you suspend them from Universities UK? Would you take action?
We don't. It's a very good question. We're not a regulatory body. We've got certain sort of tools that we use to try to get our membership to adhere to a set of commonly agreed standards. The admissions code is one of them. We've got an agent code of practice, which we've asked our members to sign up to. And I think 100% of members who use agents, there are a couple of universities who don't have signed up to that. We don't have a mechanism for suspending members because they're not compliant with that. What I think we do have is the ability to decide what we defend and what we don't defend. And the only caveat I'd make, and I can hear Jonathan's anger, and to be honest, I think the focus on abuse of public funding is a really serious point. We all know that the government's got its back against the wall financially. We've got, we're facing a very, very difficult spending review. If you're looking for things to cut, let's start with those things where, we've got serious questions about whether they represent good value for public money. I think that makes a great deal of sense. But as I say, I think that I'm experienced enough in dealing with Sunday Times and other journalists to at least ask the question, is what is being reported here completely accurate? Is it the whole story? I just think we need to cool our boots and be very, very methodical about how we go about addressing this issue. I think the other thing is this kind of, philosophical approach that the previous government took to higher education. They believed that opening up the market, including to private for-profit providers, would drive up quality. I think there's a big question about whether that is in fact the result of the policy interventions they put in place. And I suspect that we're swinging back to a worldview, certainly it's my worldview, that higher education is both a private and a public good, that there is a role for, the state in a sense in determining what sort of system we have. And it's not that I think that it should be top-down micromanaging by, whoever is the government of the moment. But I do think there needs to be more stewardship of the sector, and that the kind of market red in tooth and claw doesn't necessarily deliver what we need.
I think that's the real question. And, I say as someone who is I suspect probably slightly more of a market absolutist than Vivienne, I agree. I think I have increasingly come to the view that we do need greater stewardship. And that the theory of change that Hera brought in that said, we should have more providers, some form of greater choice and contestability and competition will rise standards. Whilst it has worked in some instances, I think it is now reasonably clear that the deleterious side effects of it, particularly at a time of fiscal stringency, are now not worth a candle. And I think that is absolutely the question that needs to be had. And of course, we have, in theory, a higher education reform paper coming out of the government, at some point in due course, presently, maybe tomorrow, maybe never. But again, if we as a sector don't really start to take action on this, then the risk is that somebody who is less informed just makes a judgment, right? And at the stroke of a ministerial pen, we have no franchising, or we have a profit cap, or we have student number control, right? Like that is a really, really bad outcome here, but that is also the outcome we are hurtling towards, because at some point, government is going to say, we don't like this and we're just going to stop it overnight.
I mean, obviously, there's a sort of frustration here, which is like, this is obviously a thing that is really hard to get a grip on. And I definitely go back and forth on whether I'm comfortable with the idea of higher education being delivered for profit. And I suppose the answer is, on a sort of values basis, that is something I am moderately uncomfortable with, but I can also see a case for, because it may lead, the profit motive may be required in order for certain kinds of provision to exist. And that may just be the reality. I think that's something that we should be periodically testing. The thing I think that is, there's two things that are interesting to me. One is about it's quite convenient, isn't it, for Bridget Phillipson to say we've asked OFS to make this a priority. OFS has a lot of priorities, not least, the financial sustainability of the sector. And this is the core kind of challenge, I think, in this space, which is about saying, how do you really tighten up regulation in a way that, while kind of acknowledging that there will be a kind of consequence for some institutions' financial interests, and thinking that through. I think there's a debate going on the site under DK's article, which looks at what the options are for regulatory action in this space. And one of the kind of things to think about is actually those options are, they each have trade-offs to consider, and DK's, because we've gone through quite forensically. One of the comments underneath is that OFS is not, from Richard Puttock actually, who was formerly of the Office for Students, OFS doesn't draw much of a distinction between validation and franchise. And validation is simply where a provider with degree awarding powers confirms that what is being delivered in a different institution meets the standards and criteria for a degree, and thus they will kind of sort of award the degree on that provider's behalf. And that seems to me to be perhaps a bit less of a model that has fewer bad incentives baked into it, because then you don't get that whole kind of thing about we can bring in these students, we can profit share, there's a stream of income there, and that's the sort of thing that Joe Johnson really wanted to kind of avoid, because he didn't like the idea of kind of one provider being in hook to another. But I think there's something about providers that are delivering higher education need to be directly regulated on a set of criteria that maybe, and so it not least so that you can deter those people who just want to make a quick buck. Sort of thing. It should be a little bit difficult, maybe not as difficult as it often is, but it should be a little bit difficult, and and that validation arrangement might be in place, and that might work a little bit better. The other thing actually is about Bridget Phillipson's statement about domestic agents, and that to me seems fraught with peril, because we have seen lots of terrible behaviour from agents, promoting access to student finance on TikTok and really framing it in terms of, here's some free money for you, and this is obviously horrendous. I wonder to what, that's something that I think is worth getting into, not because does that then make it impossible for any university to contract a third party to do its marketing? And in a context when we're trying to look for interesting ways to generate efficiencies in the sector and to think about how universities might use models like outsourcing and so on, that creates, I think, quite tricky area to start navigating. So that's something that I think will continue to drive some of the conversation as well.
So that's about it for this week. Remember to go in deep on anything we discussed today. You'll find links in the show notes on wonkhe.com. Don't forget to subscribe. Just search for The Wonkhe Show wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to get ahead of everything that's going on in UKHE, just click subscriptions on the site to find out more. So thanks very much to Vivienne, Jonathan, Debbie and Michael Salmon, who makes the show happen behind the scenes. We'll be back next week. Jim will be here. Until then, stay wonky.